Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. It's another Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, where we say many things. But one of the things we have said many times before is that you do not have to be religious. That does not mean you get to lie about history, science, or religious people. So please support our work on RedPillReligion.com, RedPillReligion.com, where every day we have at least one new video or stream by ourselves, by one of our friends and contributors. We also have articles written either by our volunteer team or by people who submitted stuff to us. And in fact, in these days of social media censorship, please remember RedPillReligion.com is the most reliable way to find us. We've had multiple. It's been okay lately, but we've had multiple attempts to take us off of YouTube. We were banned forever from Twitter. We recently got suspended by Patreon. Patreon reactivated us mysteriously. Don't know what's up there. But in the meantime, you can find us. We could use your spiritual and financial support. Patreon for now. You'll also find us through PayPal. Many people make recurring donations through PayPal to see this kind of content going on. You will find us on Patreon at Red Pill Religion. You'll find us on Gab AI at Red Pill Religion. You'll find us on Maker Support at Red Pill Religion. Find our Facebook group, Red Pill Religion, as long as it's still there. That one keeps getting threatened too. So, but please come on by. And also, especially if you're a nerd who likes hanging out, talking about video games, philosophy, history, science, nerdy stuff, and philosophy. Everybody's welcome. We got atheists, we got anarchists, we got agnostics, we got witches, we got pagans, we got Christians, we got Jews, we even got the occasional Muslim come and talk to us. So please feel free to come by if you want to talk. We're in our Discord chat room. It's free to the public, and you'll find the link to that down below. Now, I am really honored to say that tonight we have a guest, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. Say hi to everybody, Dr. Brown. Hello.
Hello.
Say hi to everybody.
I'm happy to be here. I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
I'm terribly sorry. Can you hear me better now? I'll keep my voice.
The internet's gone weird.
Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that. You sound fantastic here. I'll try speaking up and a little more closely into the mic. So thank you for joining us, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. Can I call you Rachel?
Yes, please.
Hi, Rachel. Okay, please call me Max. In case anybody doesn't know, Professor Rachel here has had an interesting experience over the last couple of years, which I'm not going to belabor too much. If you want to know a lot about it, Milo Yiannopoulos has an article you can see up on Dangerous. I believe I put that article, well, the article link to it is in the low bar. That's for sure. Here it is. The Middle Ages, Why the Battle for Medieval Studies Matters to America. As per usual with Milo, when he actually sits down to write a serious piece, it's a very serious piece and it's very well written. So even those of you who just think he's a shit stirrer and all that should remember the other side of Milo, which is when he buckles down and says, I'm going to write something serious, he tends to do it extremely well. This is something a lot of people, even who have trouble with some of his public persona know about him. And it's an excellent expose of something that's been happening to Rachel here, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown here, where basically she's been being subjected to what anybody who was part of Gamergate, anybody who was part of Comicsgate, anybody who's part of Sad Puppies, anybody who's part of Rabid Puppies, everybody who's part of quite a few other things, would recognize as an SJW attack, which seems like an odd thing to be happening to a professor of medieval studies, for goodness sakes. It all boils down to, I mean, she's simply writing really boring books no one would ever read about the medieval.
They're not boring. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. My books are very exciting.
They are. They're the most exciting books you will read all year. They're action-packed.
Look at me. Look, you just click. There's my blog. Look at me with Milo. How can you say that anything I would do would be boring?
That's right. That's right. There she is. In fact, you're friends with Milo. You have been. How did I'm actually? I really don't want to make this all about Milo, but give you the short.
Well, you know, it always can be if you want to. Yes, I've been friends with him for about 2 years now.
Oh, I'm so glad. How did you meet?
I wrote to him. This is the week anniversary. I wrote to him and said, you know, dear Mr. Yiannopoulos, I teach at the University of Chicago. We just had the letter that went out that got everybody paying attention to Chicago, saying that we at the University of Chicago don't have safe spaces or trigger warnings. And I was curious because, you know, as a good medievalist, I think you should, you know, give someone a proper inquisition before you declare they're a heretic. And so I went and watched some of his videos from the first leg of the Dangerous Faggot tour, and I really enjoyed them. And Tom Cicada mentioned that he had written to Milo and Milo wrote back. So I thought, well, I'll try. And so I wrote to him and he wrote back. The thing is, I think I told him about the adventures that I had already been having with some of my blogging and with my colleagues in medieval studies. And I think you could ask him why he wrote to me. But what I've learned since is that we both share a deep interest in helping people understand Christianity and its importance to Western civilization. So that we're a bit of a team now is because we actually share that spiritual and cultural mission.
To a large extent, a large amount of the Red Pill Religion team sees it similarly, and it's kind of unusual because we're not all Catholic. But for example, two of my right-hand men, John Baptiste and Andrew Chatelites, one is Eastern Orthodox and the other is a real serious Orthodox Anglican. But they see the same thing we see, which is that ultimately there's this concerted effort to rewrite history to make the Catholic Church in particular look as bad as it can be, which some Christians are down with, but a lot of Christians, including a lot of non-Catholics, are not down with because they see where it's going, right? I mean, like my Eastern Orthodox and my Anglican friends can say, oh yes, they'll be bashing the Catholic Church real hard, but it'll be our turn real quick because, you know, they treat us like we're just Catholic light or whatever, or the same. And it's really more, I think, about attacking the ancestral roots of what we call around here on Red Pill Religion, we call it the little o Orthodox Christian faith, which is the Christian faith that involves priests, sacraments, rituals, prayers, including formal prayers, going regularly to something you call the Mass and taking something called the Eucharist. This actually describes a good number of Protestants, or sort of Protestants like the Anglicans, because this is actually our spiritual roots. A lot of people.
Well, what you're describing to my Max, what I think, so I like the little o Orthodox label that you gave to that, and what you're describing is a liturgically informed Christianity, a Christianity that is actually about worshiping God, and so that its center is not trying to be some kind of social work organization, which is an aspect of Christianity, but if that becomes its center and becomes secular, it sort of loses the point. The point of Christianity is to stand before the throne of God, singing with the angels, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory."
Well,
so, and you know, it's like orthodoxy is the recognition of that liturgical focus, I would say, and so absolutely that it's large O Orthodox, Anglican, Catholic. It's all of the traditions that are strongly focused on understanding the significance of worship.
Yeah, and this may seem foreign because this form of Christianity is not the most prevalent in the United States, and so even, you know, some Christians are listening and don't know what we're talking about. I think the only thing Rachel and I will probably both agree on is this is why I became Catholic, and I was not raised Catholic at all. I was raised mildly anti-Catholic, if anything. Speaking of which, though, the point I want to make about this is, let's say you're not even Christian. Let's say you're even still an atheist, or you're more of an agnostic or whatever. What you ought to be able to do in my opinion, and this is what these academics ought to be able to do, is be able to look at something like Buddhism and how incredibly important it is to, whatever word you would use, to understand how important Confucianism and Buddhism are to understanding Chinese culture, understanding how Shintoism and Buddhism are hugely important to Japanese culture. And by the way, that stuff is all over a lot of the anime you guys watch. And fascinated by it, and you don't realize it has very deep spiritual roots. The Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is not the only one with deep spiritual roots, as we often say. But the one that's from Europe is this kind of Christianity, guys. It's the one that involves all the, what some like to look down on it, they call it smells and bells, and all these fancy rituals that you don't need. And it's actually very much at the heart of how much of European history developed and culture developed. And it's there even in things people don't see.
Well, and I absolutely agree, and that's when I say Milo and I have a mission together, that is one of the things that we are really trying to think about, how to show people, because we're so immersed in that culture, even to the extent that sometimes the idea of the secular is itself a Christian formulation. I talk about this in my history of European civilization class a lot, that if you think of yourself as secular, you're already thinking within a Christian framework, because the secular is that which belongs to this world, right? But if you have a this worldly and otherworldly division in your understanding, what you're basically thinking of is in terms of heaven and earth. And so the very idea that there is such a thing as a sort of order that fits with the saeculum, the age, the secular, you're already thinking within Christian structures. And Max, what you're saying about how we need to understand Christianity as the source of the culture in the way that Buddhism or Confucianism or Shintoism are their cultures, absolutely. And it's very interesting to me that Westerners often see themselves as kind of having a blank, right? It's like we practice this destruction of our own culture so much that you often don't even notice anymore how much, I don't know, take any modern art form is actually informed by a very long tradition that fits within this Christian framework. It's modern popular music, right? All those love songs. It's actually, a song tradition that goes back not to the 60s, but to, the 1960s, but say to the 1160s. It's all that courtly love and love poetry that transforms into the tradition of romantic love poetry that we have in the modern world. So I agree with your description that I think that's an appropriate way to think about what we need to be able to see at the root of our own cultural tradition. Or, for example, I'm sitting here in my room at home now. I'm looking at a manuscript facsimile that I have on the wall, and it's a 13th century moralized Bible, which is, you see it, it's little discs, little images in discs, and text on either side. Well, that's a comic book, right? You say your guys like reading graphic novels. That's great, right? I did on my blog some posts some years ago on sort of the Bear's theory of comics, Fencing Bear, my blog, Bear's theory of comics, and how comic strip art is actually a wonderful representation of the theology of the incarnation. You'd have to search for it and find it. They're from like many years ago.
In fact, I love comic books. I have since I was a kid, and still love comic books, by the way. And one of the things that'll get me is some of my comics friends will look at some old religious painting or drawing, even if it's beautiful, and interpret it in the most primitive way possible. Like, so like when an angel is being shown with wings in the air and stuff, they'll think that that's always a literal representation. They seem to understand people can do symbolism in their art now, but they don't seem to understand that that's an old tradition too, right?
Right, but now I can, if you can find it on my blog, you've got it up there. It's this sense of the interaction between text and image that's actually quite important, and what is it's lovely in a sense of that you can do a, here I found it, a wonderful sense of this interaction between the visible and the invisible. So like
you'll have to share your screen to show that to us, Professor.
Yeah, comics are neither novels with pictures nor pictures with captions, but something wholly other, a hybrid of text and image with which it's possible to tell stories that can be seen as well as heard.
Oh God, yes.
Comics are preoccupied with superheroes and superheroines and their battles against evil because there's something in the form of itself, word plus image, that presupposes this kind of story.
One of the very best books, I recommend this to all you guys.
Yes, I talk about that one. Yes, Scott McCloud is magnificent.
Amazing book. This is an amazing book. Everybody ought to read it. I'm glad you read it, because I mean, I would have recommended it to you. He even goes into there about how many ancient images, including religious ones, are the basis of where comics come from.
Well, they are, and what I like is that I have the comics like Christ are a paradox. They participate in the visible fleshly world because they're images, but they also, by way of their speech balloons, enable us to see into the interior of their characters. And yet the speech balloons are more than just words that we hear. We, the readers, can also see them, although their speakers cannot. In this respect, unlike animated movies where speech is still articulated as sound, comics show us the word exteriorized from the soul. Likewise, Christ, the Word, became visible to humanity at the Incarnation while still remaining divine speech. So it's wonderful because a lot of art does this kind of interaction between text and word, and that McCloud, I think, is magnificent, right, in the way in which he shows you how the picture, you can't do comics with just words or just images. You need that interaction between the spoken and the visual.
Unique unto itself, and people have actually seen this for thousands of years. They weren't that primitive. Hey, listen, I have some formal questions I want to get out.
Sure.
Before I forget, Jean-Baptiste, our Eastern Orthodox religious studies friend, he says one of your specialities is, quote, scriptural exegesis and hermeneutics, unquote. What is the academic definition of same, and how is it used in practice?
Wonderful question. So the academic function, the academic version of that is something I think my colleagues in biblical studies would say I don't really do. Modern textual criticism, modern biblical criticism is on the one hand very heavily historical with the books themselves, right? So if you study New Testament, you're most likely going to be involved in some kind of study placing the composition of those texts, the Gospels or the letters or Revelation, into the period in which they were actually written. And so a lot of that kind of criticism becomes very heavily historicized and historical. What I'm involved in is the way medieval commentators read those texts, and they had rather different perception on what the history was that they were talking about. And they also think in sort of systems of symbols that modern commentators don't recognize as valid anymore, and that's large. It's a long story from the Reformation, the way in which this medieval tradition of reading was rejected. In the Middle Ages, the way commentators read was very contemplative, particularly in the monastic tradition, and they'd start with the understanding that a text tells a story. So the text that I've worked on the most, and Max, if you scroll down, this first one, that From Judgment to Passion, my first book there, that one is a study of, you're scrolling past it, the way in which medieval commentators read the Song of Songs as a kind of conversation between Christ and the Virgin Mary. They'd say historically it's, say, written by Solomon, King Solomon, as a marriage hymn, but also historically it's somehow about the life of Christ and Mary. And you'd say, well, that's not historical, that's making it up, or that's, interpolating, or that's allegory. But in medieval commentators' understanding, what they're doing there is understanding the story behind the text. And then there's all sorts of layers of what the text can tell you about the soul and its relationship to God, what it can potentially prophesy about the end times in heaven, and so forth. And so scriptural exegesis and commentary is, in my practice, is understanding that medieval tradition of devotional reading.
That makes a good use. So in other words, you're almost trying to explain to moderns how and show moderns how the ancients thought. Would that be a way of putting it?
Yes, and what's challenging is, of course, modern commentators, what say if they read the Song of Songs, they'll emphasize, well, it wasn't written by Solomon. It was possibly a pastiche of stories. It may or may not have been intended as an allegory of God's love for Israel, which is the way the rabbis read it. And they'll sort of break it down into its ancient setting. And say, well, these readings that are suggested by medieval commentators are just fantasy, right? And in my second book, my Mary and the Art of Prayer, I make an effort of suggesting, well, maybe the early Christians are fairly consistent in the way that they apply their imagery. Yes, that one. The way they apply their imagery, and perhaps they're not, in fact, just making it up out of nowhere. That they have a very structured system of titles for the Lord, for possibly his consort. This is a big debate in Old Testament studies, whether Yahweh, the Lord, as he's named in the ancient Hebrew tradition, had a consort in the temple, whether, like many Middle Eastern temple cults of the time, there's a representation of both the masculine and the feminine in their divine. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a character called Wisdom who may or may not be in relationship to God in those terms as bride or consort. But in the medieval tradition, Mary is read as wisdom. And she's read both as wisdom and the mother of wisdom, which makes her a very deep mystery, because you're trying to understand how she was filled with God. And the text that I'm talking about in my second book, in the Mary and the Art of Prayer, showing the way in which medieval commentators saw her as this kind of temple where God becomes present. Now, all of this sounds like utter nonsense to most modern Christians, even Catholics, because there's been a lot of pressure put on this ancient tradition since the Enlightenment, and you were earlier talking about. Now I can't remember whether we were recording or we were earlier talking about that problem of the way in which modernity represents the Middle Ages and distrusts it and makes fun of it. Well, a lot of it comes from the way in which people read the Bible in the Middle Ages and the historical criticism that's been brought to bear on the Bible. And I'm obviously interested in the Marian element of it, but one of the things that happens in the Enlightenment is that older tradition is basically made fun of. It's laughed at. I mean, literally laughed at. It's like, this is ridiculous. I have a story at the end of my book about how Casanova, the great lover, is given one of these Marian treatises to read, and he says it basically, he figured the inquisitor had given it to him to read while he was imprisoned in Venice had meant to drive him mad by giving him this nun's meditation on Mary as this temple and wisdom character. So this whole tradition is lost to modern day Catholics for the most part, and of course Protestants utterly reject it.
Not all. But
well, okay, so most Protestants pretty much reject it because they say you can't find Mary in Scripture. This is an inauthentic reading of this tradition, and therefore the medieval tradition must be wrong.
You know what? And I want to launch into that one in a minute, but I'm going to ask a couple of the more dry questions first. I think you've mostly answered this, but let's go ahead and pitch it at you anyway. How important was scriptural exegesis and hermeneutics in scholarship, the clergy, and the populace in the Middle Ages? How important was it? My guess is an awful lot, actually, but I mean, how would you answer that?
Everything. The way that most people knew the Bible was not the way modern Christians know the Bible. If you go to like the Museum of the Bible now, which is a good experience, I think, at the new museum in Washington, they have an exhibit on the Bible as a book, and that's the way modern Christians tend to think about it. Like you since the Reformation and since printing has made it possible for everybody to own a book, you think of the Bible as this book that you maybe read. But what medieval Christians tended to encounter the Bible was the liturgy, through the worship. So when I was saying earlier that the small Orthodox is about worship, what most medieval Christians knew would be the portions that they'd heard over and over and over again in prayer, and the particular text that all medieval Christians, if they could read, would know was a set of prayers and psalms called the Hours of the Virgin. which is what I focus on in my Mary and the Art of Prayer. And the reason they would know it is because if they learn to read, they use psalters or books of hours specifically focused on this Marian practice. Medieval Christians would also hear sermons that would be typically the Franciscans and Dominicans, the friars in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries were great preachers, and they have vast training aids to talk them through how to preach on scripture. They'd preach on a particular passage and then sort of unpack it and show all the themes and work through all the symbolism, tell stories, animal allegories, you know, outrageous story. They're trying to keep everybody awake and paying attention, right? And so late medieval preachers were actually quite animated and very good at it. And people's understanding of the Bible would come through that, right? It's both a written and an oral tradition, and it's richly sort of layered, right? It's more like the way people now know something like Star Wars, right? It's like maybe you've seen the movie, you've read the fan fiction that goes with it, you've told stories around that, you've participated with your friends in imagining yourself into those stories. You might take on the characters. All of that is a devotional activity that would make perfect sense in the Middle Ages, because you're trying to understand what it's like to be in the story of the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Christ. And
which is actually
to do that, it's a highly imaginative and lovely sort of storytelling. The other way that people would know the stories is, particularly in England in the later Middle Ages, the towns would put on plays, right, mystery plays, because they're about the mysteries of salvation, and those plays would go through the history of salvation from creation to the apocalypse. And so every year you would get sort of your town would put on these plays, and the people in the towns, according to their craft guilds, would do particular parts of the story. So people's knowledge of the scriptures was very, very rich, but it was very living, right? It wasn't just as a book that you sat down and read. It was something that you inhabited in your story world.
And the last question we got from John Baptiste, I'm even just going to answer it. Should we as humans use this in our own serious study of the scriptures? I'm just going to give a resounding yes, because I can tell you that, having not even read either of her books, my soul just sings listening to her talk when she talks this way. As people around here know, we are a secular show and we bring in people all the time, but I'm noted for my high devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And one of the reasons I'm Catholic is because of all the things that we're talking about here. And the only
it's a tradition focused on beauty. I mean, in my page that you're showing them, I say what I study is prayer. If you scroll back up, you say how I study is sort of craft. I like the practice of getting into these practices, understanding what it's like to see from within this liturgical tradition or from these stories. But why I study, if you go into my why, it's joy, right? That this is an amazingly joyful tradition. It's the image that medieval Christians have constantly is one of delight and beauty.
And in fact, one of the things I would say is that as a daily rosary prayer, if you're doing the rosary properly, which takes time to get good at, you're doing just about everything that Rachel just said there. If you're really praying the rosary right.
and that's it's
doing exactly everything you just said. It's remarkable, actually. It's that little collection of beads.
And what you're saying there, I'll give you a little meditation to go with that, right? I talk about this in my book, and I showed you that readers, if the book is an academic book, and so it's a little expensive, but there's a chapter that my publisher put online that you can read just as a online book that's about the Ave Maria, and the Hail Mary.
Mary and the Art of Prayer, Ave Maria.
The Ave Maria. And of course, if you're saying the rosary, what you're saying over and over again is, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. Blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. That is
scriptural,
the I'm sorry?
That's all scriptural, by the way. Every line you just said is out of the Bible.
It's scriptural, and it's the greeting the Hail Mary are the word, or the Hail, and Mary is added in the meditation. The Hail is what the angel Gabriel said to Mary when he came with the news that she was to become the mother of God. And in their medieval miracle stories that I tell in that chapter about how when you say the Hail Mary, Mary, who's with us now and assumed into heaven and queen, but experiences in her heart and in her womb the same joy that she felt when she first heard the words of the angel announcing to her that she becomes the mother of God. And that it's what I say in my story is like, if you've been pregnant, which I in fact have, it's that amazing joy of feeling the child move in you at the first time, and there's nothing like it ever. That you know you're carrying life, and the meditation that you are participating in when you say the Ave Maria is greeting her with that joy over and over and over again. It's very erotic.
It's surprising how much you find things like that. I'm going to say it is every time we start talking up Mary, we get a lot of Christians showing up telling us this is not Christian, this is fake, this is pagan, this is wrong, you're going to hell, flinging Bible verses at us. The only thing I'm going to say is you're just wrong, and you're reading it wrong. Sorry, but you are.
Well, and you can read my book where I show you how Scripture was actually read in the Middle Ages as talking constantly about Mary. It's a completely scriptural tradition.
Look for a fabulous book called Hail Holy Queen by Scott. I'll see if I can bring it up here.
Oh, yes, Scott. So I actually note that Scott and I are actually making the same argument. His book is a little easier to read than mine, but he sees the same scriptural tradition that I'm talking about in more detail. Definitely.
Scott Hahn is a former Calvinist, a former Presbyterian, a former sola scripturist. He will go into amazing depth for the average Bible Christian about why not just the Catholics have been saying about Mary for 2,000 years, why it goes back to the undivided church, why it goes back to the first century church. Guys, if you want to be anti-Marian, it's up to you. What I also like to point out is that even if you are anti-Catholic, which there's a lot of those out there, if you go look at the oldest lines of Christianity, the Assyrian Orthodox, who left in the early 400s, the Oriental Orthodox, also sometimes called the Coptics, left in the late 400s. This is all 1,500 years ago. And of course, the Eastern Orthodox, there was the split in 1054, so about 1,000 years ago. That's actually the four distinct oldest branches of Christianity. And the Anglicans will make claim on some of this too, and somewhat the Anglicans will make claim on some of this too, and that's the vast majority of all Christians for the last 2,000 years. So if you're saying that they're wrong, what you're actually saying is that Christ allowed the church to go into apostasy, not just the Catholic Church, but all the world's Christians for 1,500 years, until suddenly the Protestants decided they had it right. Because we can show this going back not just with the Catholics.
Well, and the other thing I say is Scott, I've actually spoken with Scott, and we found that our story is actually quite parallel. That I also grew up Presbyterian, so the Calvinists are returning to the full tradition. But that both
I grew up Calvinist too.
Yeah, but both Scott and I recognize that. I mean, one of the things is what I think happened in the Reformation, the 16th century, is the church literally split in two, right? It's not so much the Catholic Church kept all the good stuff and the Protestants went off and did their own thing. It's like they each kept a part of the full tradition. That Calvin, you mentioned Scott was Calvinist. John Calvin, in his study of the doctrine, was deeply influenced by monastic commentators on Scripture back from the 12th century, some of the ones that I talk about in my first book. And so he's saying that the scholastics kept all of this hidden from Christians and that he's recovered it. Well, what he's doing is recovering a monastic understanding. He gets rid of some other things that he shouldn't have, but that what I hope I've done in my own studies is bring back two parts of Christianity, this one scripturally focused tradition of commentary and thinking, and the other the devotional liturgical. And we need both, right? It's really not Catholics versus Protestants. We need to understand that both those traditions come out of medieval Christianity in very important ways.
That's right.
Also, what I would say is
Martin Luther himself made the sign of the cross and approved of the Hail Mary prayer. So that's an
well,
important.
and he was a monk.
Yeah.
Luther was a monk. He just wanted to be a better monk than he was capable of being. No, he spent too much of his time worrying about small sins and confessing all the time, and then he had this moment when he realized that in fact he didn't need to do that because faith alone saves. It's psychologically a very interesting story. But the other thing I would say about Christians worrying about whether or not Mary is part of the tradition, ask yourself why she's in the Bible at all, right? Even there's zero reason for Luke to tell the story that he did about the angel coming to Mary, unless the fact of Christ's mother matters deeply to his identity as the Lord. And it isn't just that she's a humble peasant woman who gives birth to somebody who's kind of good, right? She's the mystery depends upon God becoming incarnate through her, and therefore it's very, very significant that she has that conversation with the angel that she does. And Scott and I both talk about that in different ways, but similarly, that when I say the angel came to her and said, "The Lord of all, the creator of heaven and earth, is now present in your womb as a baby." Basically, your head should explode with that mystery. It's unthinkable that should be possible.
Mm-hmm. And what I like to say about it is that the way little o Orthodox Christians, who are a majority worldwide, have always understood it is that Christianity has always run on an ancient oral tradition, just like the Jews ran on an ancient oral tradition. The Pharisees sat on Moses' seat. That comes from ancient Jewish oral Torah. You know, those who put the Bible together felt that it was the books that best represented what they already believed to be true. And so when you approach, let's say you're from one of these Protestant traditions who says it's wrong to pray to the saints. The only thing I can tell you is that if you can check not just Catholic but other sources on why this is correct and why it's biblical. Now, maybe you don't read the Bible passages that way, but here's the thing. Countless Christians for thousands of years have read them that way. And that's the point I would make about what's wrong with most historical analysis, most scriptural analysis these days, is they do take this historical approach, this very dry, this very clinical, this very analytical approach, with no respect for how the people who preserved it and lived it forever actually saw it. And it's a very different way of looking at things. Like, for example, the average modern thinks there's no such thing as God, so we're already off into la-la land. Well, a lot of smart people think there is a God. God is best understood as the eternal, beyond time and space intelligence that's running everything. Okay, and the Christian tale from this perspective, I've told it this way before. And it goes like this: God, who already existed, as God, decided to become human, decided he was going to really become human, made himself a mother, got her pregnant with himself. Well, it goes into, and he became a man and walked around and lived the whole gamut from infancy to being a helpless infant to having to suckle, to having to obey his parents. By the way, that's in the scriptures many times. He was obedient to and subordinate to his parents. You see that to both of them, by the way. And actually, the way it is traditionally seen is that the full end of that was at the wedding at Cana, where you see Mary's very last spoken words in the Bible as he announces his public ministry with his first big public miracle. Her very last spoken words are, "Do whatever he says." And she never talks again in the whole Bible.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, as a story, the thing is that the Gospels as stories are amazingly well crafted. And so yet taking them seriously, not just as sort of, I think that a lot of modern historical criticism, unfortunately, sort of takes the. I mean, it depends. It's a complicated field, but there have been efforts to try to figure out which bits are the real things that Jesus said, or which bits are actually historical and which bits are more theological. And the thing is, they're all theological, because they're all trying to show what their authors understood about Jesus and the mystery. And so absolutely every sort of juxtaposition and phrase and
that's
detail,
the thing about small or orthodoxy too.
Absolutely matters.
Every word matters. Every event matters. But
because you understand them to be purposefully composed. And so what I try to show in my books is, I mean, medieval commentators understood this purposefulness as well, and they're trying to discern that with different techniques maybe than we use. But I think that a lot was happening in the 16th century, and one was that Protestants were consulting with the Hebrew scriptures that they had. But another of the things I talk about a little bit in my book, which is worth thinking about, is when the 16th century reformers are reading the Hebrew, what they're reading is a text that was put together by the rabbis in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries of the Christian era.
Yeah.
It's the Masoretic text. And what the early Christians were using was the Greek Septuagint, which carries older layers of understanding that the Christian, I mean, this is a hugely politically complicated and controversial claim to make, but the Christians had the older version of the scriptures, and they thought that they were reading those appropriately, and that raises all sorts of very, very complicated and difficult questions about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. I mentioned that Protestants and Catholics need to recognize their common heritage.
I'm with you on this.
Jews and Christians do as well, right? We really come out of we're a split tradition of interpretation.
Of course, it's actually very interesting. I don't want to get too deep into this, but I mean, this is a point I've actually made too, and it's one of the things I've gone the way I have scripturally. It has become all the rage to use the Masoretic text, the so-called original Hebrew texts, in modern biblical translations. Catholics are doing it as well as Protestants, and I really think they should consider stopping that. And
I would agree.
I have friends who are literally rabbis, okay, and I actually came to Catholicism in part by getting to know Jews, Orthodox Jews.
Mm-hmm.
But it is simply a fact that, we've got evidence from both the 4th and the 8th, 9th centuries that, let's just be blunt, the Jews very much do not believe Christ was real, or that if he existed, he was bad. And it is not to accuse anybody, especially anybody today, of wickedness, to suspect, intentional, either ideological, unconscious, or intentional corruption of those texts. The Masoretic texts are not necessarily the most reliable. I think it's a foolish that we have gone to just trusting them. The Bible translations that almost all Christians were using for the Old Testament was something called the Septuagint. The Greek Orthodox still use it. The other lines of orthodoxy, like the Catholic Church created its first translation, its Vulgate, based on the Septuagint. But the Assyrian Orthodox, translating into their language, and others going back 1600 years, still were relying on that Septuagint.
So if you want to show them a book, there's Timothy Law, When God Spoke Greek, is a very good account of the New Testament authors' dependence on the Septuagint. There you go. And for a long time, he also does a nice job of showing that for a long time, Septuagint scholars were just worried that it, contained this less reliable version, but they've come around to realizing that, in fact, it may represent some of the older readings, and those are the ones that the New Testament authors were drawing on. So when they claim that Jesus is fulfilling the prophecies, they're reading the prophecies in that Greek version.
What I would say about it is that obviously I'm with you on this, but it's the fact of the matter is the gospel texts were written in Greek.
Right.
The gospel, according to John especially, was written to the Greeks and uses language only Greeks would know, like logos. And all of them, with rare exception, when they quote from the Old Testament, do not quote from the Hebrew. They go straight verbatim and quote out of the Septuagint.
Right, they're quoting the Greek.
Which is basically apostolic endorsement of the Septuagint, of the Greek, as far as I'm concerned. We can't assume that, you know, a Hebrew version, from a Christian perspective, we can't assume the Hebrew version is more accurate unless we can predate it to, you know, we can find fragments that predate the Septuagint.
And we can't.
And guess what? We have found fragments that do, in Hebrew, that do seem to match the Septuagint better than they match, like, the Masoretic texts. So,
right. Right. So all of this, and this is why this is a very, for my own book, My Mary and the Art of Prayer, I've been getting, you know, I've started to get, it's an academic book, so reviews take a while to come out, but I know that all of this is sort of in the ground of what I've tried to show about where the Marian tradition comes from. And it's hugely challenging for people because there are so many controversies over almost like every piece of my story, from whether or not, you know, in the ancient temple, the Lord had a mother or a lady or some other kind of relationship, what the early Christians were doing in describing Mary at all, where the Marian tradition comes from in the early church, how much it depends on understandings prior to the Council of Ephesus, which is the great council in which she's recognized as Theotokos, the Mother of God. The transmission of this tradition to the West from the Greek, which happens largely in the 7th and 8th centuries when there are a series of Greek and Syrian popes in Rome. It's like you walking through, you know, like the Indiana Jones when he's going into the temple and he has to, in the opening of the movie, the first movie Raiders, and he has to tiptoe around all the little sliding pavement stones that are going to shoot arrows at him. That's what doing scripture studies is like. You have no idea when you're going to get shot. And no idea when, you know, someone whose particular focus is on one aspect of this tradition will say, well, no, we know that that's not true. And it's always framed by certain confessional claims. It's pretty much impossible to do without acknowledging your own faith position from the beginning.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of moderns don't want to believe they have a faith tradition, but as we've shown over and over again on this show, they do. They
right.
very much have a faith tradition, one they don't want to recognize. In fact, they'll loudly bellow that they have no faith. Faith is belief without evidence and all that kind of crap. And that's not true. And at some point, I would think a lot of the people, see, here's the thing, and we haven't even gotten to this, and we're almost out of time. The corruption of academia has been both ideological and political, and a lot of it is metaphysical. You know.
Oh yes. So if you want, I have a vow that I always talk about Milo in any interview that I do because it matters. The one of the play as he shows in middle, well, he actually tells in Middle Rages some of my story, but one of the places where I got in most trouble was I was asked to write a little newsletter piece for the Divinity School at the University of Chicago on what I thought his campus tour 2016-2017 showed. And if everyone remembers, that's the one that was disrupted at Berkeley, great riots and such. And what I suggested was what Milo was doing in his talks was in fact triggering people's anxiety about a religious perspective, right? What he was pointing to in effect by people's responses to his talks was a religious crisis in the academy. And the responses I got to that, my colleagues were very mad at me. They said, we have no, you know, we're not religious. We have this secular idea and we're living according to, you know, race, class, and gender theory is simply our analytical categories. And I'm like, no, they're not. You are holding a religious position and not willing to acknowledge it as a religious position. So I agree with you utterly there. We are in a deep religious crisis, and many of the people involved in it won't even acknowledge that that's the character of the crisis that we're in.
That's right. While not every atheist fits this description, for example, these seculars taught in these universities have and practice a specific form of atheism that's very identifiable and very predictable, actually.
Yes.
And one of the things that's funny about them is they get really mad when you start identifying it for them, and describing their own belief system to them, and describing why it's all faith-based, because there's so many things these social justice leftists and these academic moderns just accept on faith that literally you can just question it. You don't even, like, really, you believe that? Can you back that up, kind of thing? Start applying skepticism to them, and all kinds of things happen. And I really believe a lot of these people, there was something, I used to call this a conspiracy theory, but there was something called the long march through the institutions, and the cultural Marxists who've been slowly changing academia all over the place. And I think for many, many people, they just assumed it would stop with the stuff that's political. But no, the goal
No, it's a cultural project. And it's a religious project.
Yes, and it's a so-called scientific project. I talk to scientists about this, and there are some scientists who are in complete denial, thinking that the hard sciences have not been invaded by ideology like this. Oh, they absolutely have. Scientific naturalism is part of this ideology, and scientific naturalism is not science. It is an ideology of science, and not even a very defensible one, actually. But that's for another conversation. Well, we're running out of time here, Professor. I'm having so much fun. But I did want to ask about this. On August 29th, you asked for people in the community to sign a letter in your support against slanders going against your person simply for holding the opinions that you do, and accusing you of having opinions you don't. How has that gone, especially since Milo published his long article about it? How's that gone for you?
So it was, in fact, the Middle Ages article that inspired the National Association of Scholars to put the letter out. So that was very nice. And we just sent out a thank you to everybody who signed the letter. We've received, amazingly enough, more than 1,000 signatures. About 300 of those are from other professors or graduate students, so people in academia at the moment. But hundreds of them obviously are from people who have academic degrees, right? And I have on my own Facebook page what I call my salon, which was originally kind of a joke, and some people say it's a little precious, but whatever. That my idea was, my page is public, and people who are my friends or friends of friends can comment on it. And I've been trying to practice the difficult conversations, as we say. I mean, we're in a big conversation about Islam right now, because I need to think through that a little bit. And many of those people were also willing to sign the letter. And so we divided it out. The National Association of Scholars divided it out between academics and those with academic credentials. And then there's a third category, which are random laypersons, who are people who don't have university degrees, but are also supporting me. Obviously, and many of them have written directly to me and said thank you. And what I learned is, of course, that this crisis in academia affects everyone. It affects those who are students now. It affects those who were students at some time and depend on the academy as a particular kind of credentialing institution. It affects those who have children who are going through college and who are worried about the kind of education they're receiving. But it affects people who don't go to college as well, because this transforms our culture in very significant ways. And it's obviously frustrating for me that I have so many colleagues in the academy that either won't stand up for me and say she's not said anything that is worth being called a white supremacist for, or who are calling me a white supremacist simply because I say Western civilization is a good civilization and is worth defending for its good, as well as criticizing for its failures. But our criticisms in Western civilization typically are on the basis of criteria that we developed in Western civilization. So there you go. But that I've gained so much support from outside academia that it heartens me, because like you and your listeners on this show, people care, right? The things that I'm talking about, religion and history, scriptural exegesis, devotion to Mary, these matter, and they're not just academic problems. They're problems for people's real experience in lives and understanding of what it means to be alive and human, and hopefully with a purpose in life. So it's been great. I mean, getting a letter, I mean, I was a little skeptical about the utility of the letter, because the letter itself asks for my university to say something, and I don't think they're going to. But I think partly because Chicago really, it's standing on academic freedom is not to say anything. But on the other hand, I have been greatly heartened by the response to the letter, because it shows me that there are people out there who want the substance, and would like to be able to study deeply.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, one of the things I'll point out, Rachel is old enough to remember this. An older generation, the boomer generation, the one before them, used to openly debate with themselves whether or not you could have a successful university or education system run by the government, run by secular moderns. Secular moderns assured us that they could, but they appear to have taken less than a couple of generations to have completely trashed academia up and down the line, leading to an interesting question. Little Orthodox Christians created the idea of universal literacy and universal education, and created the whole education system. I honestly wonder, can secular moderns run a competent education system anymore? Because this is all completely political. You're not guilty of anything you're accused of. The best they
No, it's all completely political.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the other thing that you just said there was also in the article that I wrote for Sightings, saying the universities were founded as places ultimately where people debated theology. It's a Christian institution. And without that Christian purpose, and of course my colleagues all got mad at me because they said, oh, she wants us all to be Christians. And I'm like, well, yes, I do. But yes, I do, because I think it would be good for you. But also because, Christianity developed this process of, I mean, it's Judaic as well. Argument, wrestling with the scriptures, wrestling with our understanding, wrestling with nature. All of that depends upon a particular theological perception that we are made in the image and likeness of God, with reason and the capacity to wrestle with and understand creation. You can't have a university without that appreciation of our place in the scheme of things, as it were, in the cosmos.
Well, because it rests on the idea that there is ultimate truth, and that we can derive ultimate truth. And when you throw that idea that there is ultimate truth that can be derived, truth becomes whatever the professor says is true. Truth becomes whatever the scientist who's currently popular says is true. That's how I would put it. If you don't have, I mean, the thing is that people used to understand this. People who were not Christian were still part of the Christian Academy because they understood how important the Christian ethos was. Many thought they could keep that Christian ethos and lose all the so-called mumbo jumbo, crazy, delusional people who believe there's a God. Oh my God, they're crazy. We'll lose all that part, but we'll keep all the same values. And they haven't managed it at all.
Because you can't.
No, actually, I don't think you can at all. I actually think it's a metaphysical impossibility, and we're either going to have to rebuild the universities or we're going to lose them. But these people who've come in, the way I see them is that, their parents. It has been part of an intergenerational takedown, and it has gone through every part of academia, including the sciences. But now I'm just rambling. Tell you what, we're out of time, Professor. Did you have anything else you wanted to get out before we close up tonight?
Well, thank you for the conversation, for the questions. I hope people are curious enough to go and visit Fencing Bear and read more. I've talked through many of these puzzles and am still puzzling with them on the blog. So if you go, Max, if you can show them on the tabs, there's the Milo Chronicles are a page where I'm showing you all of my posts on Milo. There's also a page called The Lady and the Logos, if you look at more, you go to more. There's the lady in the logos. That has more of my meditations on Mary and the significance of her for my own journey, but also a sort of this spirituality that I'm trying to think about community. If they're Jordan Peterson fans, I did a number of posts about him, but they may or may not like those. And then if they're curious about the academic debate, I think you have to go back to the main list. I don't know why it doesn't all show when you're inside there. The Medieval Gate tab on Fencing Bear. No, still back in Fencing Bear. The Medieval Gate tab on Fencing Bear.
Medieval Gate.
Go to more. And Medieval Gate.
Ah, okay. Medieval.
Right. As Gamergate, you said we started. It's like this is familiar to Gamergate. Indeed, some of the people now, I understand some of my academic colleagues that are on the opposite side in this conversation are in touch now with some of the women from Gamergate. So yay, we've closed the circle.
Some of the women who played victim, you mean?
Yeah, Zoe Quinn apparently. So if you're curious about the Medieval Gate experience, those posts are there.
Oh, that's pretty cool too. Yeah, everybody, links to all this is on the low bar and also on the blog entry on RedPillReligion.com. Please do remember to find us there on RedPillReligion.com anytime we could disappear off of any other platform, including YouTube. Do be sure to check out Fencing Bear at Prayer, which is Professor Brown's blog, which she updates fairly regularly. Also, be sure to see her academic page and links to all of her books. And otherwise, this week we're back in the saddle. On Sunday, Davis Arini and John Wright and I are going to be doing an entire show on why we are Catholic, not Protestant. We have Comrade Dimitri is going to be in on Friday to be talking about, he's a non-Catholic who will be talking about deranged and bigoted reactions certain people in the skeptic community have been having toward the sex abuse scandals, hypocritical reactions they've been having over there. We are still here every single night giving you some sort of content. So please, everybody, please be sure to visit us on RedPillReligion.com. Come check out our free Discord chat room if you want to just talk with a bunch of nerds who are into history, science, and other geekery. Please, here on YouTube, give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Please tell your friends or enemies about us. And God bless everybody.